Anyways, welcome everyone. Good to have you all here, the panelists. Thank you for being here and all of the students too. This is our workshop, Inside Tech, Industry Perspectives and Networking for Graduate and Doctoral Students. And my name is Betul Erbasi Yilmaz. I graduated from the Department of Linguistics with a PhD in 2022. And I've been in Amazon, knowledge engineer at Amazon since then. And we have four other panelists today here with us, all USC alumni, to discuss their graduate student journey and also like their transition to different kinds of industries. We'll have a discussion for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A section after that for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have breakout sessions. So that's the plan, but depending on how the discussion goes, it could be like a little less or more. So in this workshop, the questions are mainly going to be focused on, like the environment in academia, what we focus on in academia versus industry, and how can you plan your graduate education if you want to switch to different kinds of industries, and some practical tips that the panelists have learned along the way in their own journey, and maybe they witnessed in other colleagues too. Anyways, I also want to thank the Career Center, especially Wes and Myra, for putting all of this together. Thank you so much, because it was a lot of, I had a lot of questions and requests, right? So thank you for dealing with all of that. And thank you for, to all of the students that are here today. We actually had one other panelist, Anna Besserman. She wasn't able to make it today. But if you want to contact her outside and you want to have a talk with her, you can contact her on LinkedIn. She also graduated, she's also a USC alumni, and she was a knowledge engineer in Amazon as well. We were actually in the same office. Now she's a localization editor at Pokemon Company International. So if you're interested, you can contact her. And let me see. I think that's kind of it, and maybe we can start with panelist introductions. Do we have a volunteer, or should I choose someone to start?
I'm happy to go first. So I'm Tanner Sorensen. I graduated with a PhD also in linguistics with 2020. And I've worked at a couple different companies since then, but for the past, most of that time was spent at my current company, Unifor. And so that's a sort of later stage startup, I guess, kind of like it's a larger company. I mean, it's like a mid-sized company now, but still pre-IPO. And my job is mostly on machine learning modeling and some applications of LLMs. So a little bit of software engineering, I've picked up over the years. But yeah, happy to take any questions and go into more depth on that too. There's, uh, I guess, going from USC, I took a couple short jobs and worked. They were interesting, and but ended up at Unifor for the last 4 or 5 years. So.
Yeah, perfect. Next, who wants to go now?
I can go ahead. I'm Peter Gekgezian. I am also a graduate of the linguistics department, and I graduated in 2017. I did 3 years as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Rochester, and then I transitioned out of academia, and I've been a learning program designer at Open Classrooms for the last 5.5 years. It's a edtech startup that's based in France but has students around the world, including in the States. And yeah, I've been there for a long time now, and I love it.
That's perfect. That's a great.
Hi, my name's Sarah Lee. I graduated again from the Department of Linguistics. We're all from the same department. We all did our PhDs together, sort of overlapping. I think I'm maybe the latest graduate. I graduated in 2022, and then I went on to do a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania. I was there for about 3 years. And then, um, like Peter, I transitioned out of academia, started a role at Amazon as a language engineer. I was there for less than a year. I recently started a new role at Adobe as a senior evaluation scientist, where I work on evaluation strategies for audio models, for example, speech, sound effects, or music.
Yes. Sarah, welcome.
Just in time for me figuring out how to get my camera to actually work. Um,
Perfect
thanks,
timing, yeah.
thanks for having me. I also graduated from the linguistics department. I needed an F1 visa, so I actually started directly with Google. It's hard to get F1 visas for in small companies. Um, when I graduated in 2014, and I did a postdoc for a couple of years in Geneva. Did not like it at all. Not because I didn't like the content, but because postdocs are a little lonely in comparison to like having a team and so on. Joined Google as a linguist, grew in my role as a linguist, and at some point started managing the ad safety linguists, which was a medium-sized team, like 18 people. And last year they sunsetted the ad safety linguists, not all linguists, just the ad safety linguists. And some people got laid off, other people got moved to other roles, like nearby roles. And actually, the majority of people got moved to nearby roles. And just for reassurance, everyone who got laid off got a job. Um, so when we moved to other roles, I moved to product, which I had been doing informally for the last 5 years. And then after formally like being a product manager for about a year and a half, 2 years, I decided that I resonate a little more with execution rather than just the defining the what and getting everyone convinced to agree with each other on what we should do. So I moved to technical program management, and I just started a role on YouTube managing a small team of program managers.
Yeah, perfect. Like you've been in Google like in a total, how long?
About 11 years in
11 years.
July, so like 10 years and a half.
Yeah.
10
Like
years.
as you can see, we like our panelists have like very different kinds of like experiences and different levels of like durations of experiences too. So you'll have a lot of insights from all of them. Perfect. So this kind of wraps up the introduction, so we can get started with some of the questions. Let's set the background first. So you were all once a graduate student and you switched to different kinds of industries. So what are some of the similarities and differences between the two environments? You can just like unmute yourselves and like go ahead.
I think now that I've been at Google for like 10 years, I think of Google as kind of a slower place because startups are faster. But in comparison with academia, industry in general is way faster. Projects are smaller. You're expected to do less of I mean, you're still expected to polish things, but it doesn't need to be 23 times of revise and resubmit. You write kind of the report of something, you send it out, people go, yeah, this kind of sounds reasonable. It wasn't completely messy and it was clear, so sounds good. You'll get like some comments on it, but it's not a revise and resubmit. So I think one of the main shifts was I felt like, oh, they're letting me get away with like kind of sloppy work. In retrospect, it wasn't sloppy at all. It was just that the bar for what counts as polished in academia is so high that people spend 6 months rewriting and repolishing 12-page paper or 40-page paper. In industry, you kind of write it and move on. You write it, you respond to the comments, you move on, as long as everyone agrees with the content.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I totally agree. It's not that the bar is lower. I think it's just that you have to quantify the level of certainty or confidence you want to have in that result, and people are okay with, moving on after you reach whatever you kind of set. Hopefully, that's at least quantified, and so you know that okay, maybe there's a 20% chance that it doesn't work or something like that. But
Yeah.
usually, I feel like that's the approach, iteration, and because it's not usually, I mean, it does depend on the type of work you're doing, but most people do continuous delivery. So like you can always update, you know.
Yeah.
We aren't shipping TVs that never get updated again anymore, you know, like things like that. So
Yeah, all of these, and I think the biggest shift for me was like as a grad student and a postdoc, when thinking about projects, I was very used to thinking about it from the very inception, ideation, like what is the goal, like what is the question, to the very end delivery. So that would include all sorts of things like, writing a grant or like putting the experiment on a software, recruiting participants, running participants, managing budget, like hiring undergraduate RAs, managing them, like all sorts of things. But I think in an industry setting, I had to get used to working with so many different people that would do like different parts of the project. So in my team, for example, I'm part of a scientific evaluation team. But there's a whole team of, software developers who are just like working on the tooling for the experiment, and like a whole team of data scientists who would, analyze the data, a whole team of like vendors who would, go get the data for us. So just like working with different, people, different teams, different parts, was like one of the biggest shifts.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of this. And then one thing, Sarah, that you had said earlier in your introduction about like the postdoc feeling alone, that was something I felt like really intensely as a postdoc. And in industry, I feel very much like part of a team. Uh, and so some good things about that aren't just, well, you're not lonely, but you have people to talk things out with, other than like maybe an advisor or a few colleagues. You have a lot of people who will give you who constructive input, but also everyone wants the result to get delivered. No, there's everyone has a stake in the project you're all working on, and it doesn't feel like, oh, this is intensely important to me and no one else cares. And that's kind of the feeling I was feeling in postdoc. One thing that is really similar, and something I was worried about as I was transitioning out of academia, is that it's still very like intellectually stimulating, creative work. I don't ever feel like, oh, I'm bored or, just doing the same thing over again. And yeah, I'm never like, oh man, I miss the days of research, because like now my days are boring. My days are not boring, but they're also with other people.
and I think one of the things that Sarah Lee, I think you had mentioned like the ownership. You're used to owning things as a PhD student because you own your thesis and all the papers that you write along the way and everything. But you're not used to owning something that other people also touch, you know. And so, and that, I think that there's a strength that you have there because coming out of a PhD programmer, or you do have that you know how to manage something from end to end. But I think the thing that's the gap is like learning how to either manage people who are also on the same project or work alongside them, depending on your role. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of
What?
dependency, right? Like
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just like saying like there's a lot of dependency on other people to complete like one single project. Yeah.
Yeah. One like I think we all kind of mentioned things that are super positive. I think one thing that might be kind of a mixed bag is that in industry, it's very, very rare for a team to care about just that it was an interesting result or increasing our understanding of something. It needs to actually be useful to the product. If it's not useful to the product, you can't afford, like in your career, like in the first 5 years of your career, you can afford to spend 1 quarter on something that's just kind of interesting. If you do that for like half a year, you're kind of on the chopping block for layoffs because like how did you move the product? How did you affect the product? It kind of um so you're kind of accountable for more than just doing good, rigorous, interesting work. You have to actually make it work and
Yeah,
move the product forward.
definitely. That kind of like we kind of like discussed this a little bit, but what are some of the advantages of being a grad student in the industry environment? So like how do graduate students actually differ from undergrad students, let's say? Like what kind of skills do they bring with them that
I
put them
think
above others?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm kind of jumping, but yeah,
No,
I
no, it's
think
just like the same thing. It's just like
the
what is
biggest
some skills that puts them in front of others in the same environment?
yeah, I think the biggest advantage is a training in rigor. A lot of undergrads treat things like an assignment rather than like a paper. And if you can think about the difference between these two in your academic career, assignments are something you kind of do in like 5 hours, hand it off, you forget about it. Papers are like, I own this. I want to make sure that this is clear and good and so on. So both as someone who came from grad school, like from a graduate background, and as a manager, I've experienced this delta between people who came in as undergrads, where you kind of needed to bring them up a little bit to like the report needs to be about 6 pages. Like it's not enough to write like a 3 paragraph or like 1 paragraph summary of what you did. And on the other hand, also kind of reining in the grad students and being like, okay, it doesn't need to be 25 pages either. Um, yeah.
Definitely.
I think this is similar, but I think I have a slightly different thought too, which is that as you grow in your career in industry, something that is necessary is to be able to handle ambiguity and not just take the assignments, right? I think as graduate students, you usually develop that ability because, usually when this may depend legitimately on who your advisor was or what kind of line of what department you're in, but a lot of my experience was not that. I was given something that I had to write my thesis on. It was more like, here's an area that we're working on, and there's these related things. Read these papers, tell me what you think. We did that for a few times, and eventually you kind of develop some sort of approach to, and you work on that. I think that is a skill that's very valuable in as you grow in your career because, yeah, if you're, like whatever entry level is, like if you're at the base level, you do just kind of get an assignment that says like, hey, we need to do that. But then at a certain point, you get things that are more abstract. You have to say what you're going to do, what the whole team's going to do, and being able to identify that is something that I think comes out of it's a skill that you do develop. So
And I think as like grad students or researchers, we do develop skills even outside of just like sitting down and doing research, like going out to conferences and presenting findings or, teaching a complex topic to undergraduate students. So these are, like soft skills, I guess, is very transferable. And something that we just like pick up along the way of doing a PhD degree.
Yeah, that's really true. Like what presenting a project or a product to like someone in a different team is definitely less stressful than like presenting your personal like research to a conference of a lot of people. And then on the other hand, you're also just used to like asking questions constantly and speaking up and depending uh where you are in industry, like how your team is, that might really make you stand out because a lot of asking questions and challenging ideas is something we do all the time as grad students, but it's not a, other people are not as comfortable with this always.
One thing worth mentioning is that you only kind of feel this for the first few years of your career, this like advantage. It kind of goes away after a while. Like my boss had a bachelor. He like when I started my boss had a bachelor, but also like 12 years of experience. I learned so much from him. He was kind of like another PhD advisor in a way, even though he had a bachelor. So you only feel it for a little bit, and then people's skills kind of catch up.
That's actually so true. Like when I first started, the first 2 years, or like my job is like very data organization and analysis focused. And I really felt that. I'm just like, I was like doing really good data analysis and organization because I'm so used to working with like large sets of data. And then in the third year, it kind of feels like, okay, maybe I'm like everyone else. That is true. Yeah, okay. So that is perfect. So we have a lot of advantages, but then what are some of the what is some of the major skills that you had to unlearn, or like habits that you had to unlearn when you started in the industry?
Perfectionism. That's like I'm still unlearning it after all these years, but it's something that you just have to drop and like fight the urge to make something better once it's good enough.
Yeah, I think another thing that I realized was it's a little bit embarrassing to say now, but I think I can say this for sure. When I first started in industry, I really didn't understand what it meant for like a code to scale, like to run like at scale where you have thousands of users. And like I didn't, I mean, obviously I just didn't know what that meant, like what you actually had to do in order to make code like make software really run. And so I was pretty naive when I started. It's kind of inevitable because like that's just not you're not going to get those skills like doing a PhD because your code runs on your computer usually. Like that's just it. That's it. Or so and so it's not it is a weakness. Like you aren't going to get that experience during grad school, but neither does like a undergrad CS student or something like that really. I mean like you might learn some more concepts, but like until you go to industry, you don't have experience doing that. And so you do have to learn what that means. And I think having a little bit of humility and understanding, like, let's not jump in all the way. Let's tread a little bit lightly, figure out what I don't know. But most PhD students do learn how to learn pretty well. So that's kind of the job. So coming at it with that attitude, and you'll probably pick it up pretty quick.
Yeah, I want to echo the humility comment. I think there's a big aspect of academia that involves convincing others that you're right. Like your whole life kind of depends on your theory being correct, like your hypothesis being correct. And so there's a lot of like, no, no, but wait, let me show you this other evidence and this other evidence. And there's like in industry, sometimes it's fine. You can be wrong. Also, you can be right and you can also let it go. What matters is that like the project moves forward and things happen. Very often, like a decision on whether something is like, I mean, I'm gonna give a linguistics example, but like something is a preposition or not. It's just a choice on what you call it. You can call it a blorg and it doesn't matter and you don't have to be right. You can just be like, I think it's a preposition. If someone says, nope, I don't think so. I think it's like a question particle, you go like, okay, cool, and move on. It doesn't matter. It's just a label. And very often things will get sunsetted before you even like look at them a second time.
I think this might be a linguistics thing, or it could apply to many social science disciplines. But I think, like, as a linguist, we oftentimes were interested in studying like very understudied languages or a linguistic construction that's like not very well known, very like obscure, like uncommon. Because, like we have to come up with new theories and like run new experiments on new populations. And that tends to be like the like very marginal, 1% of the population or sentence types, for example. And, there's no right and wrong, there's definitely value to studying, these things or populations. But as I'm in like a more of a product context, people are interested in targeting like the majority, like 80% of the population. Like what's the major use case of this product? Like who is going to be the majority like consumer of this? Not the 1%, but like more like the 80%. So I think that was kind of a switch in thinking.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of like some of my earlier dogs where I was analyzing some data to make some improvements. And then I went into so much detail because that's what we do with a PhD. Like you have to look at the data from like all possible perspectives. And a lot of the comments were like, how does it like help? Like how is it important? Like what is the impact of this? So you have to really calculate those things and like balance it out. Right. Any other points about this? If not, we can actually go on to like have to like more practical things that students can do during their graduate school. process to prepare for an industry experience and like for job applications as well. So just the general, like the umbrella question is like, how can students plan their graduate school experiences for a smoother transition into industry? But we can start with like job search first and see like if there are any skills or experiences that you would recommend that students gain throughout their graduate school to be able to get into those jobs first. Like get the interviews and like be able to pass the interviews as well. Anything that comes to mind?
I don't think I can be very helpful here because all throughout grad school and also throughout my postdoc, I was not at all interested in like going into tech. I was like fully dedicated to getting a tenure track position. So all of my training, like all of my experiences, my like networking was focused on like that goal. Um, like still I ended up at a job that I enjoy. But yeah, but if you're already thinking like in grad school about like the transition or thinking about different possibilities, you're at a much better place than I was when I was in grad school.
I might
I
suggest that, I mean, I just might suggest that you get in touch with alumni that you could plausibly be associated with. Like people who are from your program or people that you know who like graduated a year or two ago. And I think hopefully you stay in touch, or I think you're perfectly within your rights to reach out because I think what you're looking for is, I mean, obviously they could recommend you for a job like that people are usually happy to do that if they actually know you and they know you are aren't a terrible worker. I mean, usually people are happy to do that. Um, but because there's not really too much skin off if someone's back to recommend somebody. You just say, hey, they don't interview someone else will interview you and everything like that. No conflict of interest there or anything, but they might get a bonus or something if they get hired sometimes. Um, I think staying in touch with people and then probing them on what interviews are like at their company because they probably have done interviews. And then it's also probably good to ask about like just in general about how salary negotiation kind of works after you do land a job. Because everybody prepares for the interviews, but nobody prepares to talk to the recruiter afterwards who's going to try and corner you with a low offer or something like that. So try and look into that because that can happen where the people when you get a job someone's job is to figure out what you're going to get paid. And so sometimes you have more flexibility, sometimes less. It really depends on the company, the role, how hot the market is at the time, I think. But you might have enough flexibility that's worth thinking about that, after the interview as well.
yeah, I I kind of also was mainly aiming for tenure track when I was in my when I was in academia, and so I wasn't really optimizing for a tech career. However, the things that served me the most are probably curiosity. Like I was just kind of doing Coursera courses just for the fun of it, and it ended up being incredibly useful. And the other aspect is just soft skills. I got hired because a random person walked up to my poster at a conference and asked a question, and I was really excited and telling her all about my paper, and that made a good impression and ended up getting like her card and so on. I think those soft skills are really, really useful. And I wouldn't like optimize of like every single person is a potential person who could be hiring me. It'd just be like open to humans in general and uh and then people will want to work with you. But yeah, Coursera or LinkedIn Learning or whatever, those things are really useful. I ended up doing a lot of them after I started working at Google, and they were tremendously helpful. And they gave me a lot of options. So like when they were sunsetting the linguist role, like I had multiple options. Like I was like, I could do this, I could do this. I could definitely easily interview into each of these roles because I was like studying them for years and
I think
yeah.
internships are also very important,
Oh
right? Like
yeah,
you're
internships.
probably
That's a
guessing,
great
I don't think
idea.
anybody mentioned that, but I mean, when somebody looks at your resume, I think I don't know. I don't want to be like pessimistic or nihilistic or whatever the word is, but sometimes words are just words on a page. Like, okay, but like concrete. tangible line items are important, and internships do count among those very tangible, concrete things you can do. So, getting in touch with people who could plausibly hook you up with something like that would be good to think about. Because it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be like, it could be with, just see what kind of experience you can get outside of academia during a summer, do it for 4 months or something like that, and that can be very valuable, I think.
Yeah. I think also anything that you do as like a grad student that's like project management or like you like grant applications, leading a team, having like, TAs or RAs that you're helping, like anything like that, where that's something that's very, very easy and good to transfer into industry. And I think, when I was just focusing on like academic positions, that was like sort of at the bottom of what I wanted to highlight. I wanted to highlight, all these papers and conferences, and it's really those like experiences, having to like communicate and collaborate and deal with uh like funding. That's good. That's something that's really relevant, I would say.
Coming
Maybe
back,
one, okay,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think maybe one more thing that I recommend is just if you develop the ability to highlight how you're excellent at whatever it is you're doing, even if the job you're applying for is not the same thing that you've been doing as a grad student, the fact that you strive for excellence is something that's attractive to hiring managers and so on. So like figuring out how to say like I got accepted into this many conferences and this many, like kind of quantifying things in a way that highlights how you're great at academia, even though it's not an academic job.
Yeah, I think that makes me think of like kind of how I started thinking. Like, I also, in the first half of my PhD program, I also wanted to stay in academia, but then at some point, I decided maybe, another job would be better. But then a part of it was like, what am I good at? Like trying to figure that out. I knew that I didn't like coding, so like I was thinking of a tech job, but I didn't like coding. So like, what am I good at? I realize I'm good at data analysis and data organization, just pattern recognition. So then I started looking for jobs that actually highlight that. And then I was able to find this role. It's also important, it sounds like it's also important that the students understand what their strengths are and then understand the large like landscape of job types in the industry, right? So like there's usually like we don't like before I started looking into specific data jobs, I didn't know what a knowledge engineering was. I had no idea. I had never heard of this role. But then it turned out to be a role in tech that doesn't require coding, but also a lot of data exposure. So do you have any comments on that? Like students having an idea of like the types of role that they can look into, or should they be focusing on a specific thing?
I think
Oh,
optimizing for, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I saw this question beforehand, and my answer would be no, because so when I was in grad school, so Batul was a close friend of mine. I knew she became a knowledge engineer. And I knew Sarah, like she was a linguist at Google. So I knew like people went into tech and like got these titles. Um, but so my title currently at my company is an evaluation scientist, and I'm the first person at my company to have this title. So like, this role did not exist like a month before. But now, with like AI models, there like is a need for like a whole team of people to evaluate models in a scientific way. But this did not exist in like, just a year ago, for example. So yeah, like with the landscape of tech changing just so rapidly, I think like you can kind of never expect how the landscape is going to change by the time you're going to graduate. So it's really hard to like I guess prepare. Um, but yeah, like you never know.
Just like huge echo to everything Sarah said. Basically, exactly. exactly that. I think flexibility is probably the main thing you want to invest in, and like ability to like teach yourself things really fast. Roles have been getting sunsetted and created so fast over the last 3 years since Gen AI exploded. And so, yeah, maybe they're not hiring this kind of role anymore. Like maybe there's no linguists being hired at Google anymore, but there's other roles, there's analysts being hired, there's AI analysts being hired, etc. So just kind of being flexible and trying to grow a flexible AI friendly skill set. And just like knowing AI, like just being able to use AI very, very well and understanding the quality around, I mean, especially for linguists, for people with training in linguistics, being able to understand like the language, sorry, the quality issues around AI is great. But also those will change too. So just like investing in learning how to learn.
Yeah, definitely. Coming, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, so for my specific role, I'm at an ed tech company, but my role is more on the ed side. So I got this role in part because of like my familiarity with like teaching at like a university level, but I would venture to say that like teaching experience or like supervising, that's something that's also helpful. Uh, maybe not as much if you're not in like a specifically education focused role, but having to teach something or like supervise a lab, those are those are also things where it gives you. I mean, those are also things you can like leverage positively, and it's not something that you necessarily like would want to neglect if you're looking at a job outside of academia.
Yeah, I think the skill, so like for my role, it's AI scientist, and I would say well, you can get skills in academia that are very useful there. I think, for instance, it's pretty common for people to use statistical models, machine learning models, whatever, for various purposes. In grad school, you maybe use those models more for inference on parameter values rather than for prediction, but you could, but I mean, but the models are sometimes the same from the basic machine learning perspective and statistical analysis perspective. The valuation methodology, like performance metrics that you'd be familiar with from that, are going to translate really well because like LLMs are very different, but at the end of the day, a lot of problems have to be solved with looking at like uh, precision recall, like I don't know, things that are kind of basic or like error, like different error metrics that you'd be familiar with. So I think figuring out like you might have a skill set in something that doesn't seem too similar to like the nitty gritty of LLMs or something, but probably at a certain level there are contact points for sure with that, and it depends on how applications focused you are. Like if you're doing applications of LLMs rather than inference or something with them, like it's going to be you just have to, it's like a data analysis problem and at a certain point, in part. So I think finding out what those parts of your work are that make contact with the job that you're looking for is good, and trying to cultivate that in some sort of an internship or just during your regular work is important.
Yeah. Students had some questions about internships before, so they submitted when they were registering. So one question is like, when should they be looking for internships? Should they be looking for them like from the beginning because graduate school process is kind of long? Or when should they be starting? And then what should they do if they cannot land an internship during their graduate years? So is there any alternative ways to actually make up for that experience? We kind of talked about some tips here and there, but we can maybe like wrap them up in one sentence.
I don't know if there's like people might have different opinions on this. I think probably look for it after you finish with your qualifying exams, just in terms of like, but I mean, there's no right, you could do it earlier. Like it's really a matter, like, I don't think there's from the outside looking in, I don't see like anytime is fine. But I mean, there are constraints that you're going to face with your actual PhD program, and it might not make sense to do it too early. So I would, but yeah, so it probably ends up being something late, a little bit later, like where you're not, um, trying to juggle an internship and coursework, for instance, like that sounds like kind of a nightmare. But after that, and then I think if you can't land one, maybe look at like contributing to open source projects. Like if you're interested in coding specifically, maybe look at c- uh, becoming involved in some sort of an open source project. Sometimes those are more interesting than an internship, anyways. Like I I've not really contributed a whole lot to open source projects. I'm more of a consumer, I guess. But I definitely could see value in doing that. So
I think if you know, yeah, I think we might differ a little bit. I think if you know for sure that you want to move to tech, starting earlier is better. And trying again and again because internships are actually kind of hard to get. Um, and yeah, if everything aligns and everything's beautiful and perfect, you'll get your internship at in the summer of your fourth year, and then you'll do your fifth year, and then you'll go get the job after your fifth year. But things aren't usually that straightforward, and it's very likely that in the summer of your fourth year, you'll apply to a bunch of things. It'll be a bad market, and you're not going to get anything. And it's really useful to have done something in the past. Um, Another thing like one thing that internships get you is if even if you don't get converted, like yes, I mentioned like if you do it at the end of in summer of your fourth year, then like you might get converted like within the year. But even if you don't get converted, like if you're doing it early, every time you do an internship, you now have a team who knows you, knows your work, is likely to either in the future hire you or individuals from that team are likely to refer you to their future teams because things move around a lot in tech, so you're basically like establishing a reputation for yourself within like a small circle. So I actually, if you know for sure that you want to work in tech, I would start as early as possible trying to get internships and like just do them in the summer. Don't juggle them with coursework. Dedicate all your time to them. Don't do a bad internship. A bad internship hurts your career more than helps it. So I would say yeah, just the summer is just fully for the internship and yeah.
yeah, I think that is a good point. I mean, if the stars align, I guess yeah, it's
Yeah.
best to do it right at the end. But yeah, I mean, it's because you don't have to. I mean, even if you got it, you didn't like if it doesn't work. I guess you don't have to accept it. But ideally, you just if you get one, just try and get your foot in the door. Uh, and
One
you'll
yeah.
meet a lot of people at the company. So.
Yeah. One thing that like some teams want to hire an intern, they want to like they have someone who wants to mentor an intern and they don't have a headcount to hire anybody. So they're actually more likely to get an intern who's not looking for a conversion because they don't actually have a headcount for anybody. So like just go in, do a great job, leave, and maybe in 2 years they'll come to you and say, "Hey, we actually have a headcount now. Do you want to come join our team?" Um, yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments about this? If not, we also
I
have
think
some questions. Yeah.
I guess I just say like a lot of the time interns kind of have flexibility, like they're not as tethered because they aren't staying for a long time, so it doesn't make sense to necessarily to onboard them to everything. So you're not in the day to day, which is usually pretty good for you because you get to do something probably that's a little, I mean, ideally you get to do something that's a little bit closer to your PhD topic. It can actually something that maybe you could use for your thesis, possibly. And then people usually the rest of us are kind of jealous. It's like, oh man, he gets to work on something that's really out there. Wow. But so sometimes that's kind of nice being an intern.
To second the jealousy comment, I think a lot of people want to mentor an intern because there's a project they really, really want to work on, but they can't because of all of the obligations that they have. And so it's kind of a really cool opportunity to work on a self-contained project that's like kind of cool usually. Like I mentored an intern at some point on like a self-harm classifier. I really wanted to work on it. I was kind of a little bit too senior to work on it at the time, like on that particular work stream. And like they wanted me on other things and I was like, "Can I get an intern, please?" and it was awesome. She did a fantastic job, and she works at Spotify now. And she actually did not want to convert. Yeah. And if she ever applies to any role that I have, I would very highly recommend her. So like that's kind of an example of the make a reputation for yourself early.
Nice. Yeah. Perfect. There are also some questions about networking. So, because it's kind of intimidating because you need to write to people and talk to them. And a lot of times students think about like, what am I going to talk about? Like, what should I be asking? All of those concerns. Do you have any kind of like low stress strategies that you used or like anything that you can tell them now that they can use now that you went through that?
I mean, honestly, just be nice to your grad school friends.
Yeah.
I think like, this like depends on your program, but in our program, probably like 95% of us ended up in non-academic jobs. So, all anyone and everyone I knew from grad school is in like some type of role that's outside of academia. So that's really your network. And like everyone you meet at conferences, and it's not going to be like an industry network at that point. You just like talk about this paper topic that you're interested in, or your thesis topic, or you're just like grad school experience. And then they become like part of your network. So, for me, like I don't think of networking as like this intimidating experience of like showing up to some networking event and like talking to strangers. It's more like, throughout grad school, I think you have plenty of opportunities to just like meet people that have like similar interests or at are similar stages for many different reasons, and they just become part of your network.
I 1000% agree. Just be nice to your cohort, like both your grad school friends internally to your university and at conferences. Don't be competitive. People will not be competing for the same job. They will actually probably be your plug for a job rather than be competing with you for the same job. Um, I think aside from like just be a nice person and make friends and be likable and like make people want to work with you. I think another thing, like if you want to network with more senior people to get advice, just have a template email and send it. Have it be polite and nice. You can nudge again, like someone if someone doesn't reply or replies and then flakes, they're not actually judging you. They're probably just busy or got sick or their kid got sick or whatever. Just nudge again a month later and say, "Hey, I'd just like really would really love to chat with you if you have time." I think the kinds of questions that you want to ask, depending on who it is, like depending on what level of their career they're in. Where junior people, it's like, "Hey, how did you get your job?" With more senior people, "Hey, what are you looking for when you're hiring people?" Um, I think honestly, people love talking about themselves and people love giving advice. And so like if you reach out to people and like you can get somehow like if you actually reach the point of like having the Zoom call with them or the Google Meet call with them, at that point you've kind of it doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you're not being a jerk somehow in the meeting and saying like, yeah, I'm so awesome. You should all be want to hire me or something. Um, as long as like you're being nice and friendly and asking them questions about themselves, there's very few wrong things to do there. I wouldn't ask very vague questions. Like I've gotten emails where someone like reached out to me and was like, "Hey, Sarah, I saw that you graduated from USC. I'm like, I would love to work at Google. Do you have any advice for me?" And it's just such a vague question. And I'm like
Mm.
just a vague, "Do you have any advice for me on LinkedIn?" I'm like, "Hi, nice to meet you. Apply for jobs." Like I don't know what to tell you. Like ask something specific, like how do you get your job? How like or like if you want to ask the question on LinkedIn, you can, but usually you're not very memorable when you do that. Like trying to get on someone's camera is gonna get you more of a connection to like I mean the camera or in-person events.
Yeah, we have as grad students, a lot of the time you do have the nice thing is that you get to travel a decent amount to conferences like that. That's pretty a pretty good perk of being a grad student. And I don't know if like it is kind of hard and awkward to like walk up to somebody and have a real angle of trying to get a job. Like you that can be kind of awkward. Like but so I don't know if I would Like unless you really, really need a job like right now, I wouldn't, bring that up like when you first meet somebody, but usually at a conference there's other things you can talk about that are relationship building. Like if somebody just gave a talk, you might actually have questions about what they're doing, like having, presenting yourself as someone who's an interesting person, knowledgeable, and can talk about something of mutual interest is probably good enough so that if you see them again at another conference or, you just message them after the fact and say, hey, it was a pleasure to meet you. By the way, I'm looking for internships. So if you're hiring, just like let me know. I'd love to apply. That kind of thing. That's a like there's pretty natural ways to approach that, but don't yeah, it is awkward if somebody kind of doesn't understand how to talk to other people and walks up to you and wants a job like out of nowhere. It's kind of that is weird.
I think maybe one piece of advice for networking with people that you don't know that well is don't be too spiky in the way you talk to them. Don't be like, oh my God, it's so cool to meet you. You're so awesome. And like, can you tell me about yourself? And like make them feel great for like 5 seconds about themselves. And then like the next day, like act like you don't know them. Then they'll be like, that's actually worse than them not knowing you. Um, it's kind of a weirdly memorable, like that person was kind of weird. They were so nice when they needed advice, and then they were kind of jerks when they didn't need anything from me anymore, or when they realized that I didn't have a current opening. Um, Not everyone like I think it's actually more important to network with people who don't have a current opening or current referral to give you, because those are the ones that like in a year or two, like it's not utilitarian. Like it could also like just be nice, basically. Like and when you're nice and consistent, people will want to work with you. I think one thing that I think is a big deal is like people want to refer people who they would enjoy working with. So just kind of show that you're someone that would be enjoyable to work with.
Yeah, this kind of networking also, like, it doesn't sound really good to ask for a referral if you need one just out of the blue. Like, you don't talk to someone ever, you're not interested in their like in their work, and then you suddenly ask for a referral. So I think networking is also like a good groundwork to keep in
I,
contact and keep.
I wouldn't discourage asking for a referral, even if you don't know someone. Like if someone is in another year and you're like, hey, I'm a kind of at USC, I'm in the same program. I saw that you're at Amazon or at Google. Would you be willing to refer me? I know you don't know me that well. Here's my resume. It doesn't hurt unless you're somehow like all like otherwise kind of a jerk to them or ignoring them or something. But like if it's of like a casual acquaintance asking for a referral, like it's people will say like let's say if Batul reached out to me and what like let's say I mean I do know Batul very well and I would very strongly recommend her. But let's say if I didn't know her and she reached out to me and said like, here's my resume, I'd like to apply for Google, would you refer me? The worst thing that can happen is I would take a glance at her resume and be like, seems like a smart person. And I would write like a 3-line thing that says, seems like a really smart person. I would give them a chance. And that already gets your resume in front of a human eye. It doesn't guarantee an interview, but it gets your resume in front of a human eye. So I wouldn't discourage asking for a referral from people you don't know that well. Um,
Yeah, I don't think it's like not a huge ask because really what you're
yeah,
doing is saying, well, you're just putting the person in front of the recruiter's eyes for a second.
yeah,
Like you're just saying like, hey, consider this person. And so it's not a
yeah,
huge it is not a huge benefit to you, but it does at least get you on the radar, right? Like it on the other hand, like I've gotten it before where somebody barely reaches out to me and then all of a sudden I see it on Workday and it's just like this person wants to me to refer them. Like I barely know who this person is. That's kind of weird too. Like if it's you do need some sort of relationship or at least introduce yourself in a polite way.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
some strange things. So
yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't just get it sent through the system. I would actually like reach out on LinkedIn and send a message
yes,
and say
yeah,
like,
yeah. Don't just use the formal system because it doesn't like I don't know.
it's kind of embarrassing actually to get someone you'd be like, I don't actually, what? I don't
Who
know
is
this
this?
person.
Yeah, I have to
Yeah,
Google this person. But
yeah.
Yeah.
It's less embarrassing if you get like something on LinkedIn and then you click on their profile and you're like, oh yeah, 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 they went to the same school or something,
Mm.
same department.
we're kind of out of time. Any closing comments? Because we're going to move on to student question and answers section. So any closing comments about the discussion so far? All right, if not, we can open the platform to students. If you have any questions, you can just unmute yourselves and ask your question.
Hi all. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. So my name is Lily. I'm currently finishing up my MBA here at USC Marshall. And I'm actually currently working in an ops program management role in a finance industry. So I'm actually looking to pivot into tech. So I just wanted to see what advice you might have for someone that already working in a more traditional industry like finance and then want to break into tech. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, if you were making the transition into tech today, what skill set would you want to focus on learning and building differently?
Are you looking for a program management role in tech specifically?
Yeah.
Okay, so my recommendation is to just be very comfortable with AI tools, um, and being able to talk to engineers. I think one of the main skills that a program manager needs to have in tech is being able to like process a sentence that is outside of their skill set and be okay, like basically being comfortable with the ambiguity of like someone saying the classifier's performance is not up to par, so I don't want to launch this right now, but we could iterate on the like basically like an engineer speaking engineering speak, getting comfortable with that. So I would say like make engineering friends. Um,
I think there's
um,
also like there's two kind of roles that I could see too. Like you have technical program management or like a product manager kind of role. Like I think those are two different ways you could go, right? Were you thinking more on the TPM side, Sarah, or
I mean, I was assuming program management, not
program
product
management?
management. Product
Yeah.
management is kind of more focused on like the what and
Hmm.
a bit of the how. I feel like that's kind of a different path.
Yeah.
The program management is a lot more on like we already know what we want to do. How do we get there? It's like
Hmm.
actually like
Yeah.
shepherd everyone into getting there. And that's where, I mean, in both cases, you want to be able to talk to engineers comfortably.
Hmm.
But in one case, you kind of want to be able to talk to engineers and you want to be able to talk to like executives and so on. In the program management side, you're kind of, I don't want to say babysitting because it's kind of a negative word, but you're kind of like shepherding a large group or multiple large groups of highly technical people who are really, really smart, sometimes smarter than me, like and trying to get them like kind of aligned and organized and so on. Um, and so being able to pull up a spreadsheet and start writing down things that I may or may not understand right away, but then I will understand them by the end of that week. So I think kind of getting comfortable with engineering concepts and of course AI tools. I think that's like a big thing right now for every role is everyone else is everyone else is like supercharging their work with AI. And so you want to also do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I second if you're looking for the program management role, I've seen people successful in that role who, yeah, like someone comes with some blocker or something that they don't understand, but they're like, all right, I'll write that down. What is that? And then you just spend like 2 seconds on that, be like, all right, I'll get you the right person for that. Like that's kind of
Yeah.
like you'll figure that out. So I think it is hard because like especially if you get thrown on a new project, you don't know everything. You don't, understand the nitty-gritty of every part of the project and trying to piece it all together. I think that is a difficult skill to have, but one that makes you really successful in that role.
Thank you.
I have a question if I'll turn on my camera.
Yeah.
Sorry. Hey guys, nice to see you. I wanted to ask about resumes. I have heard a lot of conflicting information about tech resumes from PhD students. Are they supposed to be more than one page? Are you supposed to put your papers on, your published papers on, like things like that? It might be field specific, but it would just be great to hear from you guys.
I can tell you, I mean, I've heard a lot of both as well. I think as long as it's parsable, one of the main filters that you're gonna encounter is literally an AI tool that's gonna like parse through your resume and filter it in or out. So you want to be able to use all the right words and put them in the right order without like too many boxes and pretty things that obscure your resume. Um, so this is like super tactical. Like this is not about the content. The other thing is I actually care a little more about numbers than I do about the actual paper. I feel like the actual paper that you've written is only relevant if the role is about of that topic. Like if you did something like enhancing data quality for LLMs, that I want to hear about. Like I want to see that paper. But if your paper was about like Singular in Lebanese Arabic, which is something I worked on, I care more about the fact that you published it. And so in that case, I want to see like 12 conferences, sorry, 12 conference talks, like 18, whatever, five papers, five peer-reviewed papers, etc. Um, am I forgetting anything? Anyone?
I think
No,
you're right about oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a great way to condense an academic resume in a way, or a CV, like in a way that you don't feel like you're getting rid of all of your academia stuff, but in a way that like someone not in your field would care about.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like
yeah. Go
maybe
ahead.
just put if there is a relevant paper, like it doesn't have to be it could be one that you're barely involved in or something, like you're the sixth author of it or something. Like but if it's related, then you put the title of it and the author, like or whatever on it. Like you actually give the real mini citation or something. But yeah, if you could say like I published 8 papers, like that's pretty good. And they don't really care what all of them are, probably. Um, this probably varies by field, like.
Yeah, it probably varies by field, also by role. So my current role is very research adjacent. So all of my team like has a PhD in cognitive science, and they presented at like CogSci, and like I presented at CogSci, and like we've like presented at same venues. So like the people who will be reading my resume will be like, knowing what the top journals are, what the top, conferences are. In that case, I think it was very valuable to like write the paper titles and like what those were. Um, so I think the job description would kind of give you a hint as to whether like your research topic would be relevant. So if your job description says like, oh, you're expected to present at conferences such as XYZ, and you have, presented at these conferences, then yeah, for sure, that's going to be super relevant.
This is
Yeah,
like I don't sorry.
I just think prioritizing anything that's concrete is really good because I've seen a lot of resumes that have a lot of like skills written on there, which are good. Like you need to make contact with the job description, but if all you're doing is writing like I can do this and this and this, anybody could write that, right? Like I don't want to like there are people who have you're a person who has very high integrity, I'm sure, but there are other people who would just like read a job description, have ChatGPT like write you something that's just like overlap completely with that job description, and then you unfortunately don't have like there's no real traction. But like anything concrete in terms of like yeah, I mean papers are concrete. I mean even if they aren't related, but the number of papers is
Yeah.
good, and then the anything that's really actually related to the thing you could write out more fully. But yeah, I think that's what I
Yeah.
prioritize. Like when I'm looking through, I'm like, is that real? Is that real? That's real? That's like that's what I look. Okay, yeah.
I wouldn't I agree. I wouldn't aggrandize too much like the keywords, but I would still use keywords. So like I wouldn't say like launched a multinational blah blah blah. It's like, well, I collaborated with someone in another country. So I would like write collaboration as a skill. I wouldn't say like multinational something something. I can't think of the specific words, but like I wouldn't aggrandize the keywords too much. I would still include keywords because that kind of goes through the filter. So like you want the tool to pick you up. Um, but yeah, I would link things to something concrete. Like uh definitely strongly like want to reiterate the put a verb at the first of every sentence in describing a role and make it be a verb you did. Like not collaborated like sorry, not contributed to, but like wrote this,
Mhm.
um, designed this, etc.
I think Jessica also asked about the length. I think I've seen a lot that are like most of the ones that I see, I think are more than one page, but
Same.
mine is one page, I guess. Like I did, but I also have a terrible resume, probably. I don't know. I need to update
I,
that, I guess.
I think I think it's actually like it's great if you can fit it in one page. Honestly, I doubt anyone cares. Like whenever I'm looking at a resume, I care about the content. I don't care about how many pages you put on it. I tend to my resume is 2 pages. I tend to have like the essentials on page one, and then page two is kind of like all of the things that I'm kind of excited about. Like here's the Coursera stuff I did and things that are kind of bragging about like not my skills as much as it is my I don't know if bragging is the right word, but like kind of showing who I am as a person on the second page. Like, hey, I'm someone who like continues to learn, and I'm someone who like did these things that may not hold prestige, but um they hold value to me personally. Like I took this course and this course and so on.
That's probably a good
Um,
idea because like you do want to be perceived as a real person, not
yeah,
just a
yeah.
PDF.
And like service and stuff could go on the second page. Things that show off, like not off, but like things that show who you are. Like things that someone could go like, okay, you have great skills. Am I gonna love working with you? Are you someone who's like flexible? Are you someone who's like um always learning, etc.?
I think one thing also to if you're applying for a type of job, figuring out what level of job you need to be applying to is good because you don't want to just match the job family, but you also want to make sure that you're applying not like if you apply for a if your company falls like base senior staff senior principal senior like that kind of leveling thing, you don't want to actually accidentally apply for staff when like you maybe only like can do the senior or something, like figure out what that is because then you can match a little bit more specifically to the job because sometimes there'll be multiple seniorities at on the same uh careers page or whatever, and so figuring out exactly you should apply to the right one probably. They'll probably figure it out internally, but they might not. It might not be the priority for them to sort you into the right bucket if you apply the wrong one. I'm not sure how recruiters work, so
Plus 1,000. Actually, that's like one of the best pieces of advice I've heard. I have a friend who once like reached out to me and was like, I don't know what's wrong with Google. Like I've applied to so many roles. Like I applied to like 3 roles here and 3 roles there and never got called back for any. And then I realized she was applying to like staff and senior staff roles.
they'll
And
you'll
she
get
had
filtered
just
out completely
graduated. And I'm
because like
like, you're not gonna get any of these. You're gonna have to apply to like senior or just like nothing before it roles. Like you're not gonna get a senior staff role straight out of grad school. Um, and so it's not a judgment on you. It's just it's the wrong level. Like
and
usually
for
people who do that have
people's
like been
awareness,
in
maybe
it.
we should say because I don't know if we actually like made that clear. It's like the this is probably I'm curious because like I've never worked for like a big tech company. I think this like they have internal leveling systems, but the way to
Yeah.
describe it across companies usually is base senior staff, principal, senior principal, right? Like that goes across
Yeah.
companies, right?
Yeah, yeah. And you can go to levels.fyi to see the comparison between different
Yeah.
companies. So like Google tends to start people at level 3. If they don't have a PhD or master's, you sometimes start them at level 2, which is very rare. But like, and then you go like 3 doesn't usually have a senior with it. 4 doesn't have a senior with it. Like 4, it's actually called Linguist 2, which is really weird. And then, or yeah, and then 5 is where senior starts. And then 6 is like staff, 7 is senior staff.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is maybe just Google that if you're not familiar with it because I kind of know it, but now I mean I know
Yeah.
how my company works and I know how some other companies work, but
And ping someone in that company to like say, hey, I have this many years of experience, or I'm graduating now or something. Um, is this role the right level for me? Um, that one you can actually ask to anyone on LinkedIn who works at that company. Be like, hey, can you help me calibrate? I feel like nobody will be like they would have to either be too busy and not notice your email or just be super unhelpful if they're like, no, I don't want to help you with that. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. We should probably go to breakout rooms now. Wes, can we